Hello friends, today's topic is overview of income tax law in India. In this topic, we will be covering why taxes are being paid by the person, why income tax is imposed, who has the authority to impose the income tax law, and various concepts regarding the income tax law components in the chapter. So, overview of income tax law in India. In the screen, you can see there is the first topic, Constitution of India. Constitution of India empowers the Parliament of India to impose tax on the person who are present in India and who are based on residency or based on other criteria are taxable based on the income that they received in India. So the Constitution of India, as per Article 246 of the 7th schedule, empowers the Parliament to impose tax on the person. So in the screen you can see Constitution of India. Constitution of India gives power to CG, SD to levy and collect taxes. This is by article, specific article of the Constitution of India. So Article 246, 7th schedule authorizes central government or state government to impose taxes. So Parliament and state legislatures are empowered to make laws as stated in 7th schedule to Article 246. 7th schedule to Article 246 has three lists: union list, state list and concurrent list. Union list is supposed to be items which list down the items which can be which central government can make the laws on the items covered in the union list. So Constitution of India empowers central government and state government to impose tax based on the laws that they will pass in the parliament. So first point, Constitution of India gives power to central government and state government to levy and collect taxes. Parliament and state legislatures can make laws, are empowered to make laws as per 7th schedule to Article 246. So Article 246 of the Constitution of India empowers central government and state government to impose taxes. 7th schedule to Article 246 has three lists: union list, state list and concurrent list. Union list is the central government, state list is the state government, and in the concurrent list, state government as well as the central government can make laws on the topics mentioned in the respective list. So the income tax law can be prepared as per the list mentioned in the union list, and the entry number is 82. So the entry number 82 of the union list of the 7th schedule of the Article 246 authorizes central government and state government to make laws on the income tax, on the income, and taxes are levied as per this article. So this was Constitution of India. So second topic, components of income tax law. In the components of income tax law, we will be covering the Income Tax Act, the income tax rules, circulars, notifications, circulars which are issued by CBDT and notification issued either by central government or CBDT. So first topic is Income Tax Act 1961. Income Tax Act 1961 was law which was passed in 1962, 1st of April 1962. It has 298 sections comprising in 14 schedules. So you will get various chapters in the Income Tax Act. It is divided into schedules and it contains several sections. Each and every section describes a particular income and how the taxes are to be imposed. Okay, so it is Income Tax Act 1961. Income Tax Act 1961 changes. It is supposed to be changed every year by the Finance Act. Finance Act is a finance bill which is passed by the finance minister every year in the annual budget. It is a finance bill which is passed by the finance minister, and once it receives the assent of both the houses of parliament and it is approved by the president, then it becomes an act and it is called as Finance Act in the respective year. So for example, if we have this attempt is for November 2020. So in your case, Finance Act 2019 is relevant, and in the syllabus you will get Finance Act 2019 as the annual budget, and the relevant changes, relevant amendments, you need to read for it. Before we move on to the next topic, I want to highlight that this syllabus or this topic that we are covering is for attempt November 2020, and the relevant attempt is November 2020, and the amendments which are applicable are for Finance Act 2019. And the relevant portion, if you ask, the chapter name is Direct Tax Laws and International Taxation. So direct tax laws covers 70 marks of your portion, and 30 marks portion is covered by the international tax laws. Further, the pattern of questions is like MCQ and practical or descriptive. So MCQ, multiple choice questions, has been brought by the ICAI from November 19 attempt. So for it is very much applicable for November 2020, and the marks applicable for MCQ are 30 marks. So it's a huge amount of marks, to be honest, and for the remaining is 70 marks is for practical and descriptive questions. So 30 marks for MCQ, you will get 4 options as that you have received in CPT. So you will get 4 options, and it won't be as simple as CPT, but you will have to get used to the MCQ questions. So in each and every topic we will be covering the MCQ part, so that you will get used to when you are appearing for the exam. So Finance Act, as we have covered in the Income Tax Act, that the Income Tax Act keeps on changing every year based on the finance bill passed by the finance minister. So the Finance Act, it is introduced by the finance minister every year in the parliament. When the finance bill is passed by both the houses of parliament, it gets the assent of the president. It becomes the Finance Act. First schedule of the Finance Act contains 4 parts related to the rates of tax. So it contains 4 parts of Finance Act which is related to the rates of tax. The first part is related to the rates of income tax as per the provisions of the Act. So part 1 specifies the rates of tax applicable for the current assessment year. So the current assessment year, in your case, assessment year is 2021, and financial year or previous year is 1920. So 2019-20 is the previous year, and 2020-21 is the assessment year in your case. So the rates, part 1 specifies rates of tax payable for the current assessment year. The current assessment year in that case would be 2021. Part 2 specifies rates of TDS of the current previous year. So the current previous year in this case would be 1920. So 1920 TDS rate applicable are mentioned in part 2, which has been mentioned in Finance Act number 2019. Part 3 contains TDS rate related to salary and computation of advance tax, and part 4 contains rules for computing net agriculture income. Next topic is income tax rules. So we have studied Income Tax Act, then the Finance Act, then there is Income Tax Rules 1962. So income tax rules are made by CBDT with reference to the Act. So there will be a provision in the Act which states that, for example, you are supposed to file an income tax return. So the section 139 will state that as an individual assessee you are required to file your tax return, and the further procedure means the further forms which are applicable and the due date applicable will be mentioned in a respective rule which is prepared by CBDT, okay, and the income tax rules, and they are mentioned in the respective income tax rules. And rules cannot override the Act. So whatever mentioned, if there is inconsistent in the rule vis-a-vis the Act, then the Act will override the rule. Circulars and notifications. So circulars are made by CBDT. They are issued by CBDT to clarify a provision of the Act, and the same is issued to clarify the provisions of the Act, and it is binding on the tax officers, on the income tax officers, and not on SSC and appellate authorities. So once there is a clarification issued, it would be an internal communication to the tax officers, and the tax officer has to implement it because there is binding on the tax officers. And the SSC, though not binding, they can use the same, they can use the circular for their benefit. And next is notifications. Notifications are either issued by central government through official gazette, or it may even be issued by CBDT to notify or to take into effect a particular provision of the act will be coming into effect once it is notified by CBDT. So we will read the sentence over here. Circulars, on the screen you can see first topic is circular, which is issued by CBDT to clarify scope and meaning of the provisions, binding on tax officers and not on SSC. Notifications issued by CG to give effect to the provisions of the act. For example, interest payable by any public sector company in respect of such bonds and debentures, and subject to such conditions as the central government by notification in the official gazette. So this line is important. Notification in the official gazette specify in this behalf that it would be exempt. So the interest payable by a public sector company based on certain conditions as notified by the central government in the official gazette will be exempt. So this is one of the example of notification issued by the central government. Then in this point, notification issued by CBDT. So in this case, issued by CBDT to make and amend rules by issue of notification. Example, prescribing rules for laying down the guidelines and condition for exemption and deduction. So CBDT is issuing a notification. It is being notified to make and amend a particular rule in the income tax rules 1962. Next is case laws. In the screen you can see there is a provision case law which is part of income tax law components. So case laws are generally come into picture when there is a dispute between SSC and the tax department. So this dispute is settled by the court. It could be appellate tribunal, it could be appellate tribunal, it could be Commissioner of Income Tax Appeals, it could be High Court and Supreme Court. So whenever there is a dispute, there is a case law, there is a hearing on a particular dispute, and it could be either in the favor of, they interpret the statute, they interpret the provisions of the act, and it could be either in the favor of the SSC or the taxpayer. Then there is rules of interpretation. Rules of interpretation is the rules which are applicable in the case of interpretation of the case law. There are several rules which are used by the court, by the courts, High Court or Supreme Court, in the construction or in the interpretation of the laws. On the screen we will read on to the case laws and the rules of interpretation. So for case laws, not possible for Parliament to conceive and provide for all possible issues that may arise in the implementation of the Act. So the Act has been made, Income Tax Act is into effect, but it requires to be keep on changing to keep pace with the coming years. So if there is any other change required, or if there is any provision which is not there in the Income Tax Act, so that can be sorted out with the case laws. And judiciary hears the disputes between the SSC and the department and give decisions on the various issues. This was case laws. And rules of interpretations. Rules help in interpretation of the law. The object behind use of these rules is to ascertain the intention of the lawmakers. So the intention of the lawmakers can be interpreted through the rules of interpretation. Significant rules of interpretation used by the courts are as follows. First rule is rule of literal interpretation. In this interpretation, what happens is the provisions of the act are supposed to be interpreted as supposed to be read as it is. If there is in absence of any unambiguous, rule of literal interpretation is the first interpretation rule. In this case, the provisions of the act are read as it is, and the meaning of the act or the intention of the act is tried to be understood by reading the provisions of the act. And after reading of the provisions of the act, we come to the conclusion that the provisions are clear and the intent of the legislation is coming, then we need not go to other rules. Reading on the screen, intention of the legislation must be found by using the words used by the legislature itself. If provisions of the act are unambiguous and legislative intent is clear, other rules of interpretation should not be used. We have an example over here. The example says SSC borrows a money and it is supposed to be invested in shares, and through these shares he may have received certain dividend income, but in this particular case he hasn't received any dividend income, but he has to pay interest on the amount borrowed for the purpose of investment. So one side we can say there is no income from investment in the form of dividend, and second side he has to pay interest income on the amount which has been borrowed. So the question is whether this exemption, whether this deduction of the interest paid on the amount borrowed will be available to the SSC. So there is section 57 subsection 3 which says that, we will read over here. Section 57 requires that expenditure must be laid out or expended wholly and exclusively for the purpose of making or earning income. So if you read first three lines, it will be like that, expenditure must have been laid out or expended for the purpose of earning income. So he has expended the interest income, he has expended the interest expense. The only thing is he hasn't received any dividend income. So whether deduction would be allowed as per 57. So if you read further, if you read first three lines, it would be like there is no negative sentence saying that, for the purpose of earning income, expenditure should be incurred. Okay, so the section does not require that this purpose must be fulfilled in order to qualify the expenditure for deduction. So the purpose is to earn income, and there is no mention in the section that income should be earned in order to claim deduction. It does not say that the expenditure shall be deductible only if any income is earned or made. So as per, if we use the liberal interpretation, the interpretation is like, if you have any expenditure incurred, then that should be available as deduction as per section 57. So there is a Supreme Court ruling in this particular case by Rajendra Prasad Modi, in which says interest on monies borrowed for investment in shares which had not yielded any dividend was admissible as a deduction under section 57(3) of the Income Tax Act in computing the income from dividend under the head income from other sources. So the Supreme Court ruling is in favor of the SSC, saying that the interest deduction will be available, and the rule of literal interpretation can be used in this case, in which the plain reading of the section 57 says that interest deduction would be available to the SSC. Second rule is mischief rule. Mischief is another word for defect or the loophole in the income tax law. So if there is a loophole which has been utilized by the SSC in saving tax, that loophole can be remedied, or that defect can be remedied by the law by inserting a new provision, or by the construction can be used by the court to remedy a defect, a particular defect. In order to do so, in order to make good the defect, the court will interpret the provisions which were present earlier, then the intent of the provision, then what is the defect in the provision of the law, what is the defect that has been used by the SSC to save taxes or to avoid taxes, and what is the new provision. After looking into all these factors, a remedy can be suggested by the court in order to cure a particular defect, and it would be through the mischief rule that the court will make good the defect. We will read the wordings of the mischief rule. Under this rule, the position before an amendment or enactment of an act is examined to find out the mischief, defect, or loophole sought to be remedied. To determine the rationale for the remedy solution, courts are expected to make a construction that suppresses the mischief and advances the remedy. Third rule is a golden rule. Golden rule is the mix of the literal interpretation rule, first rule, and the second rule, which is the mischief rule. Meaning, first, in order to interpret the provisions of the act would be read as it is, and after reading the act and applying the literal interpretation, if the solution is coming something weird or something which is not as per the intent of the legislation, then the mischief rule may be used, and they will be used together in order to obtain the correct interpretation of the law. After three rules of literal interpretation, second mischief rule, and golden rule, there are other rules of interpretation. Fourth rule is rule of harmonious construction. In rule of harmonious construction, it's like all the provisions of the act should be read in harmony with each other. For example, you are living in a particular community, so there will be varied people in the community. In order to peacefully live with each other, they should be living in harmony. In the same sense, the provisions of the act should be read in harmony with each other. So meaning of rule of harmonious construction is all the parts of this section should be read harmoniously. Interpretation which leads to inconsistency between the sections should be avoided. Fifth rule is principle of beneficial construction. In principle of beneficial construction, the SSC, if there are two views possible after interpreting the law, then the view which is more beneficial to the SSC should be adopted. So for example, you have section 90 which states that the provisions of the act, rate as per the provisions of the act, should be applicable to the SSC, and the DTA, double tax avoidance agreement, the rate may also be applied if it is more beneficial. So the rate as per Income Tax Act, as per the provisions of the Income Tax Act or the domestic provision, is 20%, and the rate as per DTA is 10%. In this case, the 10% would be more beneficial to the SSC, and the same will be applied to the SSC in this case. So principle of beneficial construction, in case where two views are possible, interpretation which is more beneficial to the taxpayer should be adopted. Sixth rule is rule of agistem generis. In this case, particular words pertaining to a class are followed by general words. Example: automobiles, trucks, tractors, motorcycles, and other motor powered vehicles. In this case, vehicles would not include airplanes, since the list was of land-based transportation. So in this example, you can see automobiles, trucks, tractors, and motorcycles are transportation, are vehicles which are used over land, and the airplane would not be considered as this at this point, because it is another mode of transportation. So as per rule of agistem generis, general words, particular words pertaining to a class are followed by general words. So as you move on to the example, automobile, trucks, tractors, motorcycles, and the general word over here is other motor powered vehicles. So this other motor powered vehicles should be interpreted only towards the other land based transportation vehicles. Then nocitur or socius. In this case, words deriving color from surrounding words. In this case, model and design, for example, model and design deriving color from the other words surrounding them, such as patent, invention, secret formula, or process or trademark, which are all species of intellectual property. So together if we read, then it means that they are all part of an intellectual property, and each and every word is related to the intellectual property. So the model and design which are preceding towards this patent's invention should be read along with the intellectual property related words. Stare decisis. Stare decisis is the view which has been accepted for a longer perspective, or which has been in acceptance since long time, should be accepted, should be interpreted, and should be preferred over other interpretation. So stare decisis, view which is operating for long and is accepted and acted upon, should not easily departed from. Next is interpretation of different provisions of the Act. So, in a particular section, there are various types of sections. One would be a charging section, which lays down the tax liability on a particular SSC. Then there will be a deeming provision. Deeming provision, in a way, SSC, based on the provisions, deeming provision extends the existing provisions, extends the existing scope of the taxability of the provisions. Then there are penal provisions which lays down the penalty. Then there are appeals and refund provisions. So there are various types of sections which we'll be covering in this topic. So first is, in the screen that you can see, is charging section. Charging section is, it lays down a liability on the SSC. It's from this section that an SSC, a person or a taxpayer, is liable to tax. So there are charging section for each and every heads of income. So in Income Tax Act, there are 5 heads of income: salaries, income from house property, business and profession income, capital gains, and income from other sources. In each of the 5 heads of income, there are charging sections. So for salary, we have section number 15. For capital gains, section 45. Income from house property, section 22. Business and profession, section 28. And income from other sources is section 56. In the screen, tax is levied by charging section. Person coming under the ambit of charging section is bound to be taxed. Section 4, 15, 28, 45 and 56. Section 4 is the charging section for all the heads of income. It is through this section that an SSC is liable to be taxed, and 15, 22, 28, 45 and 56 are a particular head of income and are a variant of charging section only. Second is machinery provisions. Machinery provisions, it's like it's working on the instruction of the charging section. So as per section 5 or as per section 15, an income of salary is taxable in the hands of SSC, in the hands of employee. Then the machinery provision says that as per section 192, a TDS on salary is supposed to be deducted by the employer. So the charging section is section 15, and the machinery provision, which is acting on the instruction of the charging section, is section 192. On the screen, machinery provisions provide for machinery for assessment and collection of charge created by the charging section. Example, TDS provisions are the machinery provisions. Then penal provisions are related to the penalty, which will be mainly comprising under section 271 to 72. Deeming provision, it, as we have discussed earlier, it extends the scope of the taxability. So for example, section 9 says that if person is rendering services in India, his income from the same, his income in India would be deemed to accrue or arise in India. So word deemed is assumed, and the same would be taxable in India since the services are rendered in India. Intended to, on the screen, deeming provisions intended to enlarge the scope of the chargeability of income under a particular head or scope of taxability. Next is appeal and refund provisions. Appeal and refund provisions, there are provisions which states regarding interpretation of appeal, which can be appealed either by the tax officer or by the taxpayer. Appeal provisions, and there are refund provisions, in which case the refund section are applicable to the SSC. In the screen, appeal provisions should be liberally construed in a reasonable and practical manner. Similarly, provisions granting refund must also be read liberally in favor of the taxpayer. Then provisions giving exemptions and relief, how it is to be interpreted. Provisions giving deduction, exemption or relief should be interpreted liberally and in favor of the taxpayers. Next topic is aids to interpretation. So there are various provisions under the act, there are various schemes available under the provisions of the act which helps you to interpret the law. So there are, earlier we have discussed the rules which may be applied by courts or the general rules while ascertaining the intent of the legislation. Now this aids to the interpretation. It could be internal and external apart from the rules. So in case of internal aids to presentation, aids to interpretation, in this case there are explanation. First is explanation to a section, to a particular section. It only enlarges a particular meaning or clarifies a certain position under the income tax law. So explanation provides explanation, clarification on the wordings mentioned in the relevant section. So as we read the bare act, as we move on further, when you will read the bare act, you will find that there are explanation to a particular section which will only enlarge a particular wordings or particular definition of the provisions of the act. It will be a part of the explanation or it will be a part of the section, and the explanation is to be read harmoniously with the provisions of the act. Then second is proviso. Proviso leads to an exception case to a wordings mentioned in this section. So it highlights the exception cases. It is to be read harmoniously with the main provision. So the main provision would say, for example, that dividend income is taxable provided, proviso, this dividend income is received by a non-resident. It is just an example. So it will be part, again it will be a part of a main provisions of this section, and it will provide an exception to what has been stated by the provisions of the act. Third is non-obstant clause. It gives an overriding power to the particular provision to the other provision vis-a-vis the other provisions of the act, meaning the overriding power, the section will start with the wordings notwithstanding anything contained in other provisions of the act. By this wording it will start, and meaning it will override the other provisions of the act. So overriding power over other provisions of this section generally begins with the word notwithstanding anything contained in any other provisions of the act. Marginal notes and headings. Marginal notes and headings, as the word suggests, marginal notes would be mentioned nearby the section. So the content of the section would be written, and at the right hand side of the section there will be certain wordings mention of the marginal notes. And headings, heading is the header of the particular section. These are to be used only when the main provision of the act is, main provisions of a particular section is ambiguous, and the heading part would be hardly of 2 to 3 words. So how it could help for the interpretation, and it should be relied for the purpose of interpretation only in few cases, only when the provisions of the act are ambiguous. So headings are prefixed to a section. Marginal notes are the notes which are inserted at the side of the sections in this statute and express the effect of sections stated. Headings and marginal notes cannot control the plain words of the provisions. Only in the case of ambiguity, they may be referred to determine the intention of the legislature. Next is definition clauses, undefined words. Definition clauses, the definition, all the definition under the Income Tax Act has been covered under section 2, and the words which are not defined under section 2 are to be, the meaning of the same are to be taken from the judicial interpretation, or either it can be taken from the dictionary, renowned dictionary. So object of the definition clause is to describe the subject matter of the statute. When the statute defines a particular word, the same should be used unless the context otherwise required. So the word, if it is defined under section 2, the same wording should be used which has been defined under section 2. In the Income Tax Act, definitions are contained under section 2 of the Income Tax Act. Moving on to the external aids to the interpretation. First is legislative history. So while interpreting a provision of the act, there may be a situation where you have to determine the legislative history, the historical facts for introducing a particular provision of the act. So for example, you have interpreted a particular provision, you are not able to know the intent of the legislation, you have used all the rules, you have even used the internal aids to the interpretation. Now you come to the external aids. So the first would be determine the historical facts. Based on what facts, based on what defect or remedy was used to introduce these provisions of the act. So the historical facts would be determined. You can either read commentary or other provisions of the act or explanatory memorandum to determine the historical facts which may be mentioned in introducing the provisions of the act. On the screen, historical setting cannot be used as an aid if the words are plain and clear. Again, so if you are in an example, if you would have read the provisions and you are clear over there, so as per rule of literal interpretation, you would have determined the intent of the legislation and the chapter is over there. But since you are not able to determine the intent of the legislation as per the rules which we have discussed, as per the internal aid to interpretation, that you are coming over here to take interpretation or to determine the intent of the legislation through the help of external aid. So historical setting cannot be used as an aid if the words are plain and clear. If the words are ambiguous, one can look at the historical facts and circumstances that prevailed at the time when the law was passed for determining the object and the purpose. Second is circular. Circular we have discussed earlier. Again, the circular part was that it will be issued by CBDT to either to clarify the provisions of the act, and it is binding on the tax officers and not on the SSC or appellate authority, though SSC can use the wordings mentioned in this circular for his benefit. On the screen, circulars are issued by CBDT under section 119 of the act. It mentions views of the CBDT on a particular issue. It's binding on the tax officers and not appellate authorities, tribunal courts, or the taxpayer. Can be referred by the taxpayer for the benefit. Next is speech. Speech is determined. Speech are the wordings of the mover of the bill. So that can be taken, that can be used as an aid for interpretation when again the above steps you are not able to know the intent of the legislature. So by reading the speech, if you may be able to interpret, you may be able to know the intent of the legislation, then you may read the speech as well. So speech is related to the mover of the bill. For example, the annual finance act passed by the finance minister, he or she provides a speech, he delivers a speech while laying down the finance bill. So the wordings of the speech can be used to know the intent of the legislation. On the screen, speech made by the mover of the bill can be used for construction. Speech in the union budget provided by the finance minister annually. Next is explanatory memorandum. Explanatory memorandum is again a part of when a finance minister provides a speech, then thereafter the copy of the bill, copy of the explanatory memorandum is also available on the income tax website. So the explanatory memorandum just states the intent of the legislature or provides a further explanation to the provisions of the bill. On the screen, notes on clauses and memorandum explaining the provisions of the finance bill can also aid in construction in case of ambiguity. So last topic in the external aids to interpretation is dictionary meaning, where the provisions of the act or where the particular term in an act is not defined under section 2, then the dictionary meaning may be used. On the screen, where terms are not defined in that or not judicially interpreted, then meanings is borrowed from the dictionary to ascertain the general meaning of the term. So this brings us close to the first topic, which is the overview of the income tax law. In this overview of the income tax law, what we have studied till now is the Constitution of India empowers the Parliament, empowers the central government and state government to make laws on the Income Tax Act. Then there are several components under the income tax law. First is income tax act, which the several sections which is a part of a syllabus. Then there is income tax rules, again the relevant rules are part of a syllabus. Then there are case laws, which will be covering in the ensuing topics. Case laws, then there are rules of interpretation for to determine the intent of the legislature. So first is rules of literal interpretation. Then we have studied golden rule, mischief rule, then rule of harmonious construction, beneficial construction, adjustum generis. So, and then we have read aids to internal, there are internal aids to construction, internal aids to construction and external aids to construction. And this would be the end of topic. Thank you.